recording. Yeah, you were just saying sort of how even expressing love to another person sort of presupposes that the language has meaning, and then this marriage proposal isn't just about having faith that the feelings will continue, but sort of this pledge to faithfulness. So
because the objective world doesn't always correspond to our propositions. History is an episode of revisions. Thomas Kuhn shows us that science is a history of conceptual revisions of paradigms, the structure of scientific revolution. So we're reminded time and again that our language doesn't always comport with reality. But if our very internal subjectivity doesn't comport with language, we're doomed. But because it does comport with language, we can appropriately revise our standing with reality. We can make plans for the future. We can make professions of faith. We can try experiments out. We can propose hypotheses. All of that presupposes, I would say, a correspondence in some sense between our language and our internal makeup, desires, thoughts, etc., passions. And the very latency of that inner world of desires and passions and thoughts, not having always an immediate hookup to things as they are as such out there, creates the very drama of what will unfold and who people really are. This is the whole thing in Sickness and in Fear and Trembling with the 3-day trial of Abraham. Abraham knew inside that this was going to be all right because he trusted God. But externally, it looked like he was going to commit murder. It looked like he was going to commit just a pagan sacrifice of his son. Reality, historical reality, wasn't matching up with what he knew inside. And if he were to utter his sentence, it wouldn't hook up yet with reality. And yet he persisted because there really was a presupposition that had to be tested if he really believed what he professed to believe. Sometimes even not given external evidence for a period of time. Go ahead.
Let me connect that back to your Rorty comment, because I think Rorty is actually kind of an interesting input in, because he's complicated, and I kind of like a lot of the things that he says, but he's a kind of quintessential relativist, and I think we can bring it back to the text with this line, and I'll try to tie this back in. But this is like the 4th paragraph or something. Such a relation which relates to itself a self must either be established itself or been established by something else. So he takes this structure that we talked about before, and then he bumps it into this binary, which is that we are just in the world of the world, or we have this bigger relation to something else. And I think he ultimately turns the something else into God, or something else is the reference to God. And in the end, the grounding for Kierkegaard in this, and I think there's something to discuss here, whether this is the right way to view God or whatever, but in this text, I think ultimately the grounding becomes the individual presenting themselves directly to God as an individual. And that then is a stopping point. There's nowhere else to go from, except for there. And then you move on in faith. So that's how I read the Abraham story as well. It's just like, there's no place else. Abraham's walking to the mountain, and he either is alone and he's going to be one of those things you talked about. He's either going to kill Isaac and become a murderer, or he's going to fail to kill Isaac and then be unfaithful to God, or he's going to, whatever. But the only thing that can possibly rescue that is him walking and being, if you will, face to face to God. And, I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Yeah.
Beautifully put. It speaks to the category of infinite passion that Kierkegaard makes much hay out of. In fact, somewhere in Fear and Trembling, I think it's near the end of Problema 1, if there's such a thing as a teleological suspension of the ethical, is this notion that faith is a passion. It's more.
Well, I want to read. Now I got to read this quote from Fear and Trembling, which I think plays right into Sickness unto Death, and it's one of these quotes that just sticks with me forever, whether or not it connects to any bigger idea or not. I don't know, but here it is. If there were no eternal consciousness in a man, if at the bottom of everything there were only a wild firmament, a power that twisting in dark passions produced everything great or inconsequential, if an unfathomable, insatiable emptiness lay hid beneath everything, what would life be but despair?
And then he says, and therefore it isn't. And therefore
Right.
life isn't like that. Yeah.
And
I
then
think
It's despair, but not despair.
Despair is required. That's one of the things that Sickness unto Death, I think, says. You can't get there but through despair. That's a proposal that we could debate, I think, maybe. But I think one of the proposals of Sickness unto Death is what you said there, Joshua, which is despair is prerequisite or whatever.
Here's a question. So you just said, like, sort of presented this. So here on the first page, he has sort of this two types of despair. One if the self constitutes itself, and the other is like if the self is constituted by something else. Where was I going with this? And now you just had this quote of, if there's nothing eternal within a man, what is there but despair? But how does that comport to what he says on the second page under B, possibility and actuality of despair, where he actually makes the argument that despair is potentially an advantage because it's sort of what separates man from the beasts, essentially. It's our ability to have despair, which is sort of the, to relate it back to your quote, which is this infinite part of man, this spirit.
Yeah, this is where my ideas are kind of half baked or 3/4 baked because you can't quite tie all these things together, and you're pointing out a version of that. You're right. I'm not quite sure how I tie that back.
Anyone else?
so. What is your question?
Oh, it's just okay. So Jim just read this quote where he says, if there's no infinite thing and no infinite consciousness in man or something like that, there's nothing but despair.
Eternal consciousness.
Eternal consciousness, yes. There's nothing but despair. But here on the second page, he says, it's actually despair which sort of separates us from the beasts, because it's this, it sort of presupposes this eternal element within humans, which would be interesting to dive into as well.
I don't know if he would say that being able to despair means that you already have to have an internal consciousness. I think maybe you have to have consciousness before you can despair. And despair in that sense, because it comes with consciousness, is a prerequisite for faith. Does that make sense? I'm pretty sure he tries to make this argument in Fear and Trembling.
So you're distinguishing sort of consciousness from something else, or?
Yeah, I thought the eternal consciousness thing was basically like sort of the Christian idea of the soul. I thought he was kind of jumping to the soul, but maybe I was wrong. Maybe that was just an assumption I shouldn't have made.
Well, Kierkegaard in this, from what I've read in Sickness Unto Death, has, in the first paragraphs, he says, man is spirit, and then he says the spirit is the self, but then he also brings in the soul. So you have the spirit, the self, and the soul. And how are those three related in Kierkegaard's mind? I actually don't know. Are they the same thing?
Don't forget the eternal consciousness.
Oh, well, that's not in the same book, I don't think.
Yeah, but I thought we were talking about in his mind. I didn't know if it was in the same book or not.
No, that's from Fear and Trembling.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I think...
So these are all different pseudonyms.
Just two.
Are they actually the same pseudonym?
No.
So I want to say something in regards to, it seems to me that Kierkegaard's theory that he's assuming in his argument for despair, at least in section B, is that spirit properly is to be understood in the ethical category. What the spirit does is always a moral question, because it finds itself in an environment, it finds itself confronted with choices that it cannot optimize or maximize all of them. And so as it decides, it cuts itself off from other possibilities. So the question becomes, how do I make this process of pruning, of character development, we might say, not inherently despair? Is there a way to get beyond despair as we lose possibility? Because what is growth, development, and time but the loss of possibilities, or at least the not actualizing thereof? So in that second paragraph, he talks about possibility and actuality, and I think he has in his mind, either this was coming down to him from Luther. When Luther talked about the freedom of the will, he distinguished will in accordance with our being able to choose, and then a unfree will that didn't even have the ability to choose. Go even further back, Thomas Aquinas has a distinction between potency and actuality, and I actually think that's what Kierkegaard's theory is here. He thinks in order to cure despair, you can't cure it like someone who's lame, blind, etc. You have to go straight to the potential that you have as spirit to be in despair. That's what has to be cured, not the symptoms. So he says, not being in despair must mean the annihilated possibility of the ability to be in it. For it to be true that someone is not in despair, he must be annihilating that possibility every instant. So it's moral. It's not handed over at salvation, the Christian would say. It is the fruits afterward. That's how I would go.
I think that's right.
Here's the formula. Here's the formula that Kierkegaard himself puts out. I don't know how this touches directly on what you said, but at the end of the first part, I think I'm sure it's the end of the A section. This then is the formula which describes the state of the self when despair is completely eradicated. In relating to itself and in wanting to be itself, the self is grounded transparently in the power that established it. I think that's a kind of a definition of authenticity for Kierkegaard, which is this, and that's why the introduction of the power that established it. That's where the power that established it comes in, and I don't know if that touches on exactly what you were saying there, but I think he's saying something like we have to get to a place. Faith really is to be what we are, and that's kind of a tautologic statement. But when you started with this body-mind division, and we emerge in this worry or dilemma or somehow despair related to, oh my God, I'm whatever, I'm a body or whatever. I'm alienated from that. The journey is back to that in a way. I wouldn't quite, acceptance is a defeatist like word, but it's to own oneself. It's to own that as the vehicle through which one has faith, and therefore, and that's pinned on this power that established it, so that you can then be that
Process.
be that process.
Okay.
With now interpreting the same, or having the same thing you started with, but now interpreting it with faith, and now owning it, and let's say relishing in it or whatever, or being in a right relation to that.
Yeah.
See, can I just?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering when you said this authenticity bit is relating itself and wanting to be itself. It's sort of the self. It sort of seemed you're presupposing that there's sort of this hidden inner self that I want to get in touch with and actualize, and that sort of seems to contradict this existentialist thing of existence precedes essence, where you're sort of becoming something that you aren't actually now. Of course, like you said earlier, there is still this givenness, but you're sort of working with the material you have and then coming to something new in the future.
It has to somehow be both. That's the tension between let's say the infinite and the finite, or
I see a lot of synonymity between that formula and then 2 paragraphs later, his possibility actuality distinction. I think the actuality possibility distinction is a distillation of the formula you cited, where when the power that posited it is transparently revealed through the subject, act collapses onto potency, and potency is only act. It's kind of like a revising of Thomas Aquinas's actus purus, which he thought God was, like God was pure act. And so he equated essence with existence. I don't agree with that at all. But subjectively, if we are image bearers of God, it seems appropriate to say that we would want our actions to collapse into our potency. We would want to be a faithful rendering of the artist's hands, of ultimate reality's purpose, fate for our lives. And so you will know the tree by its fruits is consonant with this idea of the power that posited it being transparent through it. But that is a marriage of deed and word. Word being where all the theories are laden and professions are made and intentions are worked out, and the deed where they are literally actually worked out. When those are together, we not only feel it, we know it. And then Kierkegaard's claim, we are it. And those 3 things just have to be the solution to despair. There's no room for despair in that integration because there's no potential for it. There's no break, no tension. And that's what I meant in my email by, I think Kierkegaard's remedial project is to take away dialectics from philosophy by showing us where dialectics end and how they bring us back to that integrated picture.
Yeah, I want to say 2 things about that. I think one of them is I wanted to say before was that Kierkegaard says somewhere that language is immediacy, so it's a kind of relating, I think. And in Fear and Trembling, this is kind of a jump, but in Fear and Trembling, there's a couple paragraphs where he contrasts what he's trying to talk about, like true faith, with the naive faith of a child. That's a sort of pre-linguistic, I guess, faith, where maybe not pre-linguistic entirely, but the child has a kind of faith. It looks like faith because they like you're saying, Matt, in a sense, they're pure acts. They don't do a lot of
Struggling.
They don't really do a lot of thinking in the way we think about thinking. They don't have analysis paralysis or anything like that.
Have faith to survive.
Yeah, but it's not the faith that Kierkegaard is trying to get at. And I think what we should be trying to do, if Kierkegaard is right, is to get simple after getting complicated. Does that make sense? That's oversimplifying it. But once we grow and once we mature, we realize that life is infinitely complicated. We grapple with it, and we despair because we realize we can't win, I guess you could say.
Combinatorial explosion, to go with.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Verbekey's
and then we have to somehow get back to that naive faith, in a sense, but without the naivete, hopefully, and learn to be simple again, right? And that's not like a hiding your head in the sand kind of faith. It's a trust. It's a trust in God. And I think that kind of faith is only possible if you have a particular kind of God. And I'm pretty sure that obviously Kierkegaard was very aware that his kind of God was a very Christian God.
Well, yeah, I mean, this makes me think of the relationship between the believer and the church, where a lot of us probably don't exactly fit into our church community entirely because, you go to the sermons and, the pastor doesn't sound like he's read a whole lot of Kierkegaard, and he doesn't sound too philosophical, and you just feel out of place. But I think what you sort of have to do, maybe in a Kierkegaardian sense, is sort of, put all of your intellectualizing aside and then sort of submit yourself to the community. And I guess I would also add it not in the naive way where you just, okay, I'm going to go along with everything that's being said here. It's this individual before God. Yeah, maybe this is Kierkegaard ecclesiology, but it's sort of the individual before God and then relating to his fellow man.
If there's something problematic with Kierkegaard for me, is this excessively inward emphasis, and you're just kind of going ahead and ignoring that and saying we can do that in communion. And I actually agree with you on that. I think I have that feeling of the kind of being a stranger in a strange land to some degree in my own church community, but community is a very high priority. And, being with means to some degree having faith despite that sense of being a stranger in a strange land. And I totally follow you on that. I'm not sure Kierkegaard could get along with his fellow parishioners, however.
Well, I think for me, one way I've personally applied this Kierkegaardian venture is just trying to put my intellectual pride aside and relate to people who I think aren't as intellectual as I am, and just sort of get this faith of meeting another person, this faith that's needed to connect soul to soul type of thing. And there's a lot here that I'm not saying, but I think
I totally agree with you. Humility is
humility. I think that's humility what I'm trying to get at is the relationship between faith and humility here is what is essential.
I'll give you a
with relationship to this childlike faith. I think what that requires, the move that this leap of faith requires, is ultimately humility.
Mm-hmm. I'll give you a definition of faith. Faith is going to church when the last time you went, your pastor preached on the difference between sprinkling and dunking.
Yeah, I have better examples, but I won't throw them out there.
I want to throw out a quick book recommendation. I and Thou, Julian, you might enjoy. by Martin Buber. I'm not saying everything in it is, say, orthodox, but it does grapple with the issue of, given the complexity, now I'm at the simple, and it's an achieved simplicity. It's not a naive one. How do I go about integrating the social with the inward achievement? How do I theologically approach experience with the inward achievement? And it's short. Might be a good one to wrestle through. I and thou.
Yeah, it's on my list.
Where do we go next here? What's the
I don't really go to
next?
this long paragraph.
I want to throw something quick out there. I'm really stimulated by this. I think we could say it's the locus classicus of where Kierkegaard comes short in his philosophy. He gives you a methodology, he gives you language, he gives you the art of inward achievement. After you do your Kierkegaardian rounds, you feel like you have achieved what you are and what you can feel and say and know. Now, how do you take that and go the next level up in theology and become, or shall I say, assume in your propositions and belief, the theory that Jesus prayed at the Garden of Gethsemane, namely, O Lord, that they would be one. Kierkegaard gives the subjectivity oneness, but how do we make the plural, multiform otherness a unicity? That is a great question, and it's one that cannot be sidelined in our lifetimes. We are called to it as Christians. So maybe we can entertain this together and think through how we might bring Kierkegaard's inward achievement to the outward, to the other, to our communion with with Christians. It is our call.
I think ideally, I think he sort of knew that problem. How would I say this? I think he sort of understood that problem because ideally the acting Christian isn't thinking about the fact that he's acting. Like the proverb, the right hand, not the right hand know what the left hand is doing, or whatever it is. Because in Fear and Trembling, although that is written from an outside perspective, it's written, in my opinion, it's written by a pseudonym who's supposed to be a religious poet, meaning someone who knows faith like a romantic poet knows romance, which is well, but not intimately, I guess. I guess you could say that. And in there, the knight of faith is not an intellectual. He's not someone who reads philosophy books. He is a grocer, or he's a furnace repairman. He's the kind of I guess some of us have read this. He walks home dreaming about this amazing dinner that his wife has made for him, and it doesn't matter if she actually has made it for him or not. It's that kind of simplicity. It's a very simple way of interacting with the world. It's also complicated, and that's basically what Fear and Trembling is about, how complicated it is. But the doing of it has to be simple, or you're doing it wrong. And I'm pretty sure that is why Kierkegaard didn't want to put his name on this book, because he didn't consider himself a Christian in that sense. This was written by what he considered to be a paragonal, like the paragon of Christianity. This guy he said something, I'll find the quote later, but he said something really, he said something. He basically had really high praise for his own book. He said that it did great things for Christianity. I'm talking about Sickness Unto Death. He said that book was doing great things for Christianity, and therefore he couldn't put his own name on it because he wasn't really the author of the book in the sense that he couldn't act it. He couldn't act it out. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in a way you're saying something that I was trying to say a little bit earlier, but it's going to have my own flavor to it. And maybe this is a little the older perspective. I don't know. But and it's the T.S. Eliot idea as well, that we're going to get back to where we already are, and we're going to be able to embody it in a kind of more authentic way. But where we already are, I mean, the title of the book, after all, is Sickness Unto Death. Where we already are is living this incarnate existence. And that incarnate existence is pointed towards death. But it's also not just pointed towards death. It's all the things that go along the way. It's relationship, it's parenthood, it's the love we have for other people, it's the arc of the experience we have with those people that ends in episodes of joy, but also episodes of tragedy, and being really in those things, being authentically in those things, which they're right in front of us. I mean, we don't have to go very far to be involved in those things, but being present in them such that we're not being in them in sickness unto death. That is to say, we're not being in them in this, with this pall of separation, or pall of distemper, because of this apparent, let's say, failure that the ending appears to be, which of course in Christian faith it is not. And that's what we have to be able to do, is get back to being authentically in our real experience. It's not anything other than that experience, nothing else than that. I mean, it's nothing else than loving your parents and being with them in their triumphs and in their difficulties. There isn't anything else than that, but you have to get to a place where you can be in it in faith.
It makes me almost think of a sort of stoicism in a way, where it's you're comfortable with, or at peace with the way things are,
such that the are can be all that they really are, with all of the amplitude and coloration and real depth that is the life of the spirit, to use the term, as opposed to just a cloud of electrons.
Yeah. It makes me also think of the image in Fear and Trembling of the ballerina who leaps up to the infinite and then comes firmly down with his feet planted on the ground. So it's this double movement of up and then coming back down. So you're up for nourishment and then bringing it down to earth. This infinite, finite, incarnate duality, which, I wish someone would unpack that some more.
Paul van der Kley, the Marriage of Heaven and Earth.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
The pedestrian in the sublime.
Ah, there you go.
Sublime quote.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think one of the important things to remember about that analogy is that the dancer has practiced so much that they don't have to think about the move. They just perform the move. Because the other dancer in the story is the Night of Infinite Resignation, and they're thinking about the move constantly. They're thinking about God. and they're failing to make the move. They don't come down with their feet firmly planted on the ground. They're stuck with their head in the clouds.
That's interesting. I wouldn't have thought of Kierkegaard as someone who's thinking about practice. Does that make, I mean, I often think about how, and Josh has asked the same question, is like, how does Kierkegaard relate to this sort of evangelical notion of relationship with Jesus, and this sort of spontaneous movement of the spirit and all of the weird things that can entail. So I don't often think of Kierkegaard as sort of being that much into things like Christian practices or liturgy or formation. I would have sort of put him in this box of much more spontaneous. So yeah, how do you guys think about that? And we have 3 minutes left in this recording.
I agree with you. I don't see Kierkegaard doing much of that.
I don't see him relating very well to the evangelicals in the sense that the ecstasy, the ecstatic experience, I guess, evangelicalism isn't there at all. There's definitely a personal relationship, but the who God is for Kierkegaard is Old Testament-y, to butcher a phrase. The reason he goes on and on about Abraham is because I think that's who he's still thinking of God. He's thinking of God in a different sense than I think evangelicals generally are, if that makes sense.
Have you guys seen the movie First Reformed? Nobody?
Yeah, I think he's got an existentialism for me, and this may be where I come from, but he's got a kind of existential God. This thing what was it? The something else that we talked about. I mean, those words he used, that he comes into sickness unto death with. He doesn't just drop the word God. He says that which produced the self, or whatever it was, that which the self was dependent on. I can't remember the phrase.
The other.
But I was just going to say, there's this film First Reformed, which is about this sort of Kierkegaardian pastor of this dwindling First Reformed church, who's sort of going through this crisis of despair, and he's struggling with the looming climate change and the end of the world and these types of things. And there's this one really interesting interaction where he goes to this big mega church and has a talk with the pastor, and the pastor of the mega church has this line where he says to the pastor, "You're always in the Garden of Gethsemane." You never go out of the Garden of Gethsemane. So that's sort of, in a way,
I might like that. What's the name of that?
First Reformed. I think
First Reformed.
Everyone here would find it interesting. But that's sort of the Kierkegaardian view of God. He never goes out of the Garden of Gethsemane.
I would say the way I look at Kierkegaard is, I think he was struggling through his entire life. So if I were to write a philosophical biography of Kierkegaard, I think he dealt with the problem of, how do I not make my character an idol? And rather, how do I make my character an icon of God? What does it take? What won't it accept? Because we're faced with this existentially all the time. We can look at an icon